Yeah, it's very frustrating when this happens, but here's a few ways to lower your chances of it happening in the first place. Many tenants do not even realize that the lease is legally binding, that they can't just change their mind. This is something that we make clear to the tenants before they sign. Welcome to your Landlord Resource Podcast. Many moons ago, when I started as a landlord, I was as green as it gets. I may have had my real estate license, but I lacked confidence and the hands-on experience needed when it came to dealing with tenants, leases, maintenance, and bookkeeping. After many failed attempts, fast forward to today, Kevin and I have doubled our doors and created an organized, professionally operated rental property business. Want to go from overwhelmed to confident? If you're an ambitious landlord or maybe one in the making, join us as we provide strategies and teach actionable steps to help you reach your goals and the lifestyle you desire, all while building a streamlined and profitable rental property business. This is your Landlord Resource Podcast. Hello there, landlords. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast today. I'm Stacy, and I'm here with the I can't get that song out of my head husband, Kevin. What song was that again?
1877.
Oh, God,
No.
stop.
I'm gonna stop. Sorry.
Please. All right, well, hopefully the listeners won't get that in their head and stop paying attention to what we have to say today. So, speaking of listening, today's episode is all about how to handle if your tenant wants to break the lease early, or in more formal terms, terminate the lease agreement before renewal. We will be discussing their reasons and why, for some, you may legally have to let them out of their lease.
And don't worry, we'll be giving you solutions on how to handle these early terminations. We'll also talk about the reasons that landlords can legally break the lease and remove a tenant and how to go about that too.
Yeah, there's a lot of juicy info in this episode today. So here's our disclaimer. We are here to provide you with information, not legal advice. We highly recommend you consult an attorney for their perspective on how to handle early termination of a lease, especially an attorney located in the same state or local area of your rental property.
All right, housekeeping is done. On with the show.
Yeah.
So you may be confused. The tenant signed a lease, right? Aren't they legally obligated to comply with the terms of that lease until the end date? In most cases, yes. But there are a few legal reasons why you have to let your tenant break the lease if they request it.
Yeah, and also it's important to know that this is not uncommon. We have had several tenants break their lease, one just a few weeks after signing their renewal. We will say, though, there are right and wrong ways of dealing with the tenant requests, but we'll get to those in a bit. First, we want to focus on the legally protected circumstances where landlords must allow their tenants to terminate the lease agreement. If your tenant is in the active military and they are called for duty for longer than 90 days or are forced to move stations, they can break their lease under the War and National Service Members Civil Relief Act. Active military is not just the armed forces. This federal law covers all tenants who are part of the uniformed services, which includes armed forces, of course, and active reserves, commissioned forces of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, did I say that twice? Commissioned Corps of the Public Health Service, the Coast Guard, and the Activated National Guard. So to give notice, all they have to do is present the letter of deployment or station change along with their notice to vacate. Termination of their housing lease is effective 30 days after the first date on which their next rental payment is due and payable, after the date on which the termination notice is delivered. Let me kind of clarify that. So if they give notice mid-month, say like the 15th, they need to pay rent for the following month, and then they are no longer obligated to pay you rent. Their last day of occupancy is the last day of the following month after giving notice, unless they state otherwise.
Okay, the next legally protected reasons that allows one to break a lease is domestic violence. Now, this is a tricky one. If a tenant comes to you and states they are a victim of domestic violence and they live with the abuser, you must allow them to remove their name from the lease and vacate the unit immediately. This is not a federal law and varies from state to state, but most require the victim to provide a restraining order, police report, or a letter from an officer of the law, medical professional, or therapist. This written proof should not be older than 180 days. Now, this allows the victim to vacate and leave the abuser still living in your property. If that tenant is a physical, mental, sexual, or trafficking abuser, you have an obligation to your tenants, if it's multifamily, and your neighbors to remove or evict the alleged abuser. Once you have been notified from the victim, and if the abuser harms them or anyone else on your property, be it another tenant, visitor, or someone working there, you may be liable. Again, this depends on what state your unit is located in, but typically there is not a problem with eviction when you have evidence or proof from the victim. If the victim is the only person on the lease, most states allow them to provide the proof same as we mentioned before, but they are obligated to give a 30-day notice and are responsible for the rent and all applicable move-out requirements like cleaning for the next 30 days. What if the victim still lives in the home with the abuser, but someone else notifies you of potential violence in the home? Here's where you have to do your best. Try posting the contact information for the National Domestic Violence Hotline in public or common areas like in the laundry room, a bulletin board with notices of events, or near the mailboxes. We'll link the website in the show notes.
The last thing you want is to potentially lose good tenants who do not want to live near this unsettling behavior. Often, if other tenants or neighbors are concerned and contact you or complain about the noise, you have to address it with the tenant in question. Tenants and neighbors have a right to peaceful enjoyment, and if that right is violated, it can fall to you as a landlord to resolve it. This may mean that you have to evict or ask the person you suspect is the abuser to vacate. If the victim remains in the unit, you still chance the abuser coming back and potentially causing harm or making other tenants or neighbors feel unsafe. Again, do your best to work with the victim. Allow them to change their locks. Maybe allow them to move to a different unit in a different location. And no matter what, contact your attorney for legal advice on how to handle this. And bottom line, it's just a really crappy situation that you have to work through, so just do your best. All right, so the next two reasons involve the wrongdoings of the landlord to the tenant. Just like a tenant can commit lease violations, the landlord can be cited for violations as well. And if you invade a tenant's privacy or violate their rights, they can typically end the lease early. This can be done by excessive visits to the unit or not giving proper notice of entry. Typically, this notice is 24 hours out, but in some states, it's 48 hours. If you place cameras inside the unit or even outside facing windows of the unit, this is a violation of privacy. If you rent out a single-family home and retain the detached garage for personal use, and you use that space to wrench on your motorcycle, then you turn it on and rev that motor multiple times a day, that can violate their right to peaceful enjoyment. Same if you use that space to play drums or let your band rehearse. If this is you, make sure you're clear up front before they sign the lease. Include this information in an addendum and have them sign it so that there is an understanding that this is noise they will have to contend with while living in the unit.
Those circumstances are not something we see often, but please be mindful of getting proper authorization to enter their unit. Email, text, or post a notice on the front door to have written notification. Take photos of the notice you tape on the front door with your mobile phone. The photo will have the date and time it was taken in the information section on your phone. The next legal reason for a tenant to break the lease is if the unit is either an illegal unit or uninhabitable. So we're going to hope this does not apply to any of our listeners, but units that have mold, an infestation, no heat, unsafe conditions like broken sewer pipes, no running water, holes in the roof, dry rotted stairs or decking, windows that do not open, or locks that don't work, Anything else? You get the idea. And you have made no effort to address or repair the issues are reasons why a tenant can break their lease. There is an implied warranty of habitability in every lease, which requires that a rental property meets basic living and safety standards. And if the landlord breaches this, tenants have a right to terminate your lease early without penalty. This warranty includes ensuring that the property is up to code with all applicable safety measures and that it's generally fit for human occupation. It is important to note that landlord-tenant laws in all states handle each item noted differently, so make sure you review those. They may state the amount of time following tenant notification that landlords have to make repairs before they are considered in violation of the law. It takes much longer to remediate mold issues than it takes to repair or replace a heater or a broken toilet. If tenants give notification to break their lease and are moving due to unfit conditions, they are in turn giving the landlord what is called a constructive eviction. If they can prove they have notified you, have photos, and have proof you have made no effort to remedy the problem, a court will allow them to move. Some courts may even make the landlord pay back rent or pay damages toward a new living space. Same is true with space that is deemed illegal to rent or live in. This is highly frowned upon, and in some cases, landlords have been forced to return all rents received.
Yes, in our family, that is what we would call bad.
You bet.
Let's talk about some other reasons why landlords may be asked to break the lease early. It can be for such things as a tenant loses their job or is being forced to relocate by their employer, maybe a divorce, or the tenant may fall ill and can no longer pay their rent. So what's a landlord to do in these kinds of situations? So first, make sure that your standard operating procedures and your lease have a clearly written clause on early terminations, stating what is the tenant's responsibility and any legal information as well. Things like the minimum notification period and notification requirements, any fees that may be associated with breaking the lease early, the minimum number of months' rent the tenant is liable for if it's not a legal reason to break the lease. And typically, if someone's going to break the lease, they'll be able to provide some sort of proof to back up their reason, like written notification of a job transfer from their employer, proof of illness and unable to work from the doctor, etc. As for how much time you require, that depends on you. If you prefer to put the notice at 30 days, then typically you will only hold them responsible for paying an additional 2 months' rent after moving out. 2 months' rent would basically be their penalty for leaving early and is often referred to as a buyout. This should be plenty of time for you to find a replacement tenant for your unit, so you shouldn't be out any rent at all. Of course, they would still have to abide by all the standard rules of vacating, like cleaning it and putting it back to the condition it was received in order to receive their security deposit back. And I want to say, when it comes to issues that are out of a tenant's control, be compassionate. They aren't thrilled to have to come to you with bad news, especially if you're a good landlord and you've treated them well. You may not legally be obligated to release them from the lease, but offering them an out makes it a more difficult situation better for them. So do your best to work with them and find a solution that is fair for everyone involved. We had a couple that rented one of our 2-bedroom units, and they signed their lease renewal in May, and then in June one of the parents passed away, leaving them a home nearby. And in July, they called to explain the situation, letting us know that it would take a month or 2 to transition over to the new home, but they would like to cancel their lease and were giving us notice. Now, understand, we are really nice people, but we were not happy about this. Of course, we're sympathetic about the loss of their parent, but a lease is a contract, and their reasoning for moving out was, honestly, not dire. We explained that we would do what we could to rent the unit as soon as possible, but that they were responsible for rent until a replacement had been found. However, when we went in, there were damages that we had to hire out to have repaired and preventative maintenance that we had to perform. We did not stretch the time out and stick it to them, but it did take nearly 60 days to get that unit turned and rented.
And you know what? They were very happy they didn't have to pay the full lease terms. I'm sure they didn't like paying rent on an unused unit, But they lived there several years, so they knew the repair and maintenance issues we stated were valid. We also kept them in the loop the whole time, letting them know what was being done and when we put it on the market, and when we received applications. And they appreciated that. It also showed them that we cared and respected them, and we weren't pissy about the inconvenience.
Well, not directly to them we weren't.
True. But if you get into a similar situation, do your best to turn the unit quickly. Don't take advantage of them just because they technically owe you for the remainder of the lease. Get in there, do all you need to do to start marketing it, and get a new tenant in there. Now, we want to give you a couple of tips on what not to do. Do not ever allow the existing tenants to find a replacement tenant. You have no idea what photos they will use, if they will use proper language to place the ad, or what they will say during showings. It is imperative that you, or whomever you allow to work for you, follow fair housing laws, and it is likely your tenant will not know anything about them.
So I'm going to jump in here real quick and let everyone know that the Department of Housing and Urban Development, also known as HUD, approved $30 million to be distributed to local and state fair housing agencies to be used for monitoring violations, increasing education, and, listen up here, to have more personnel in the field to impersonate potential applicants and test and try to catch landlords and management companies who are not following fair housing laws. Violations and fines will be issued, and those fines are going to be used to continue to keep this program going. So remember, you may get shopped by a fair housing employee that tests you. If you want to take a fair housing course, we have teamed up with the Fair Housing Institute to get you 15% off any courses you take. I want you to know we get nothing back from this offer except the satisfaction of knowing we are helping landlords learn the law to keep them compliant. We're going to put the discount code you need in the show notes. Back to you now, Kev.
I'm glad you jumped in there and told our listeners about the $30 million distribution. FYI, that information is an example of what is included in our newsletter, Landlord Weekly. This is the kind of information you receive each week if you subscribe, along with a deep dive into a landlord tip, a link to this podcast, and several DIY landlord-specific articles and early access to our blogs. Okay, back to the podcast. Where were we? Oh yeah, what not to do. Don't let the exiting tenant find their replacement, and don't tell them you'll use the security deposit towards rent owed. You only want to do this if they skip out without notice. As Stacy mentioned earlier, we had a husband and wife who had been in the unit for a couple of years before they vacated early, just after they signed a renewal. We didn't know that they had a small carpet over the floor of the front entrance to hide the damage they had done to the flooring until after they had moved out. Repairs for this damage sucked up most of the security deposit. Had we allowed them to credit that security deposit towards rent owed, we may have had to pay for the repairs out of our pocket. The last thing we do not recommend is to stop maintaining the unit or paying necessary bills while they're still living in the unit. As frustrating as it is to have a tenant break a lease, if they give you proper notice, regardless of the reason, you must continue to maintain and respond to maintenance requests. Otherwise, you may put them into a position of living in an uninhabitable situation and cause a remedy of you paying them. Bottom line, just do the right thing. Don't blow them off. Don't retaliate. Do not make them pay for every month remaining on the lease, even if you legally can.
Yeah, it's very frustrating when this happens, but here's a few ways to lower your chances of it happening in the first place. Many tenants do not even realize that the lease is legally binding, that they can't just change their mind. This is something that we make clear to the tenants before they sign. Before you have them sign the lease, send them a copy to review. In our email with this copy, we include something along the lines of the following statement. You understand that you are signing a legal contract that states that you will pay rent for X months, and you have read the contents of this lease/contract and that when you sign, you are agreeing to the contents of this lease/contract. After this was implemented, we started to get many more questions for clarification prior to the lease signings. Additionally, we have them initial the bottom of every single page of the lease to prove they have read and understand the contents of that page. So recommend to your tenants that they read each page completely. Our lease is somewhere in the range of 41 pages, so that's a lot of content to understand. We also, knock on wood, have never had to process an eviction. Only one time have we had to ask someone to leave due to excessive lease violations, and that was during the pandemic. Bottom line, work with the person no matter what. It does you no good to fight and insist they stay if they just simply cannot. If you own multifamily units, don't think for a second that that tenant won't complain about you to the other tenants. The whole situation sucks, but it's better to show compassion than to be a jerk.
Isn't there a saying about getting more with honey than vinegar?
I'm not sure it's along those same lines, but I get you. Honey is sweet. Vinegar leaves a sour taste in your mouth. Should we just talk a little bit more about when a landlord has just cause to break the lease early?
Yes, let's move on to that. We touched on evicting someone who is an abuser earlier, but here are some other less dramatic examples. Let me roll a couple of them off quickly. Late or unpaid rents, unapproved roommates or pets, costly damage to the unit like flood or fruit fly infestation, illegal or criminal activity, and inappropriate behavior towards other tenants or breach of other tenants' right to peaceful enjoyment. Keep in mind these violations must be written in the lease. My turn to sideline the conversation. Most state-specific leases offer the correct verbiage. We have two companies that we like to get leases from. If you do not have Landlord software, we recommend Tenant. They are a free software that has an option to purchase the lease you need, or you can also upgrade to a paid account. I think it's about $8 a month, and that allows you free leases and forms. If you don't want to use Landlord software, or you are already established with one that does not provide state-specific leases, we recommend EZ Landlord Forms. They offer leases, forms, as well as tenant screening with a free rental application to use. It's nice to have all of that in one convenient place so you can build the form list that suits your rental property business. And we will link both of our favorites in the show notes. And now back to the show.
So, really? I can continue now?
Oh, please.
Thank you. All right, so for lease violations, you can either go through the eviction process, which means you have to serve the tenant with a cure or quit notice, and that gives them a state-mandated number of days to either pay the rent in full or rectify the lease violation. If they do not, you serve them again, and then the lease eviction process starts. Here's the deal with evictions. They're super expensive. If you process everything yourself, it can be around $3,500. But to use legal assistance, it can be upwards of $10,000. You have to make sure you follow proper protocol for local and state laws. Some require you to send and post it on the front door. And if you do not have the correct dates or follow protocol to the T, you have to start all over. We have never had an eviction because we choose not to go down that road. Not only is it expensive as heck, it's extremely time-consuming. It can take months to actually get that person out. And guess what a lot of landlords find once that eviction is final? A totally trash rental property. When someone feels victimized, they get nasty. Don't like the dog in our unit? We're going to show you and wipe its poop all over the walls. We have seen this happen to others, and it's a horrible situation to go through. So what's our solution? We use the money that you would have to put towards a 6 to 8 month eviction process and do what is called cash for keys. Pay the tenant to leave the unit, generally within 30 to 60 days. The concept is to provide them with the cash to cover moving expenses, put a security deposit down on another rental, and maybe have a little left over so they feel like they won that battle.
We did this once, and it actually worked beautifully. That guy was so desperate for money, he accepted our first offer, and we had him out within about 45 days. Unfortunately, he was asked to leave because he had a flood and a fruit fly infestation, both of which he failed to notify us of. Oh my God, that unit was in such bad shape.
Nasty.
It took us months of repairs to get it rentable again. Okay, so we're on our final section, and that is how a landlord breaks a lease without cause. So the tenant did nothing wrong, but you need him out. First of all, this is a really crappy thing to do to a tenant. But most commonly, the only reason to do this is if you decide to sell your rental, typically if it's a single-family home, or the unit has major structural issues or is borderline uninhabitable and you have to do major renovations to the home, or you or a family member is moving into the rental unit. This is again where you need to know your local and state laws, especially if you own rental property in a rent-controlled area. In California, single-family homes, as well as homes where the owner lives in the rental, you can give notice of non-renewable or notice to vacate. They do not fall under California law AB 1482. Rent control in California is primarily aimed at duplexes and multifamily units. You can, however, give notice for major renovations or if a family member is moving in there, but there are a lot of hoops to jump through with notices and time frames.
Yeah, let me make one thing clear. You have to have a termination clause written into the lease that they sign and agree to. If not, and that tenant decides to take you to court for wrongful eviction, you will likely lose. It's common to have a termination due to sale clause written in most leases. If you purchase a lease online, like from Easy Landlord forms, or use one provided by a realtor or a lawyer, it is likely that clause is already included within the terms of your lease. It is also advisable to do what you can to help the displaced tenant out. Use the cash for keys method. Work with another landlord to take them on in one of their units, and give them a decent amount of time to process the fact that they have to find a new home.
And there are a lot more details that go into a landlord breaking a lease, so we will say it again. If you do not know how to process an early termination from the landlord, seek legal advice or learn your local and state landlord-tenant laws. Also, make sure you have the details about lease terminations in your lease, both for the tenant and the landlord. State how many days notification is needed, typically 30 to 60, how the notification needs to be delivered, and fees to be charged or compensation to be paid to the tenant. This isn't only for the benefit of if a tenant needs to break it, but for the landlords as well. Otherwise, you'll have to wait until the lease ends and issue a notice of non-renewal. Your best bet? If you think you may want to sell, renovate, or move into your rental, either let the lease roll over into a month-to-month rental agreement or sign the tenant up with those terms right from the get-go. Just so long as you remember, this also allows them the opportunity to move out anytime, leaving you with a vacancy before you want it. We don't mean to beat a dead horse here, but again, and last time I promise, know your landlord-tenant laws. Some states require 60 to 90-day notice, even with a month-to-month rental agreement.
Well, that is the end of this episode. Today we discuss legal reasons your tenant can break the lease, plus other reasons that have no legal backbone but really leave you with very little options but to just let the tenant out of the lease, what to do and how to be prepared if a tenant informs you that they need to terminate the lease early, what not to do when working with a tenant wanting to break their lease, and last, how you as a landlord can break the lease legally or otherwise. And that's our show for today. We really appreciate all of you taking the time to listen to what we have to say and that you find it useful and helpful. Please share our show with other landlords to help to get the word out, and subscribe or follow us on your favorite podcast platform. It helps us to move up the charts and get recognized by other DIY landlord property owners. And if you don't mind, would you please take a moment to leave a kind review of this podcast? This is the only way for other landlords to see how great our podcast is. Make sure you check out the show notes for all those links that we said we'd include. There's a lot of good stuff in there this week. So I am Stacy, signing off with Kevin, and until next time, you've got this, landlords.